Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to imagine, just for a second, stepping into the cockpit of a massive Air Force cargo plane. Right? The crew inside, they've trained for war zones. But absolutely nothing could have prepared them for what they are looking at through the windshield. It's August 2021. You're on the frantic runway of Kabul airport. And as this huge plane accelerates down the tarmac, thousands of desperate Afghans are running right alongside it. It is pure, unfiltered chaos. Because all these people, they know this C-17 might literally be their last chance to escape the country.
And amidst this unbelievable sea of humanity chasing a moving aircraft, some individuals actually start climbing onto the exterior of the plane itself. One of them is a 19-year-old guy named Zaki Anwari. Just minutes before this exact moment, Zaki was actually on his cell phone with his family. And through the phone, his family is just screaming, begging him to come back, warning him that it simply isn't safe to go alone. But looking at the advancing Taliban, Zaki, he refused to turn back. He chose to cling to the side of that massive C-17, just praying it would somehow carry him to safety.
Now, Zaki wasn't a soldier. He was an incredible football player for Afghanistan's national youth team. He was completely terrified that the Taliban would destroy the future and the freedoms he had known his entire life. So he held on as the aircraft's wheels left the tarmac and the massive plane climbed into the sky over Kabul. But the unthinkable reality quickly set in. With hurricane-force winds violently blowing against him, holding on became physically impossible. Tragically, Zaki fell from the sky and was crushed inside the landing gear panels as the wheels retracted. It's a devastating, heartbreaking example of the absolute desperation people felt to escape.
Section 1. The rapid collapse. How we got here.
So to truly understand this level of absolute desperation at the airport gates, why people would risk clinging to the outside of an airplane, we really have to look backward at the structural, rapid collapse of the entire country. Just a couple of months prior, the Afghan government and the U.S. held the major cities and highways. But when the U.S. began its withdrawal in May 2021, the map started to change with terrifying speed. And the Taliban didn't just rush the capital in some massive frontal assault. No, they were much more calculated than that. They completely bypassed central attacks and instead swept the countryside, systematically capturing and cutting off key border crossings and highways.
Their takeover tactics were just ruthlessly efficient. By blocking those border checkpoints, entire Afghan military bases were trapped. No food, no pay, no ammo, and zero hope for reinforcements. Then, long before fighters even reached a city, the Taliban actually used WhatsApp to bombard local commanders with a choice: surrender for money and peace, or fight and face execution. And many, knowing they were completely cut off, surrendered. The Taliban blew open prison gates to multiply their dedicated followers and inherited a massive arsenal along the way. I mean, they went from riding in pickup trucks to driving convoys of captured American armored Humvees. They were wielding M4 rifles, night vision gear, even flying U.S. Black Hawk helicopters. It was an unstoppable snowball effect.
Section 2. Panic in the capital.
As the map of the country rapidly turned red, province by province, Kabul became this single massive blue island. For years, Kabul was considered the ultimate stronghold, nestled in a valley and heavily fortified. But overnight, that illusion of an untouchable capital completely shattered. And this brilliantly illustrates the horrific duality of what happened next. On one hand, you have the chilling betrayal of the government. On the morning of August 15th, without warning his cabinet, his military commanders, or his U.S. allies, President Ashraf Ghani secretly boarded a helicopter on palace grounds and fled the country. On the other hand, millions of trapped civilians woke up to the war right at their doorsteps. Families gridlocked the streets trying to drive out. People frantically rushed ATMs to withdraw their life savings before the banks collapsed, all while these terrifying rumors are spreading like wildfire that the Taliban would go door to door seeking brutal revenge on anyone who helped the U.S. or the Afghan government.
Just a few miles from all that civilian panic, inside the heavily fortified U.S. Embassy, 3,000 recently arrived U.S. Marines and soldiers had to shift from an orderly drawdown into a frantic emergency evacuation. They initiated a total destruction protocol to keep intelligence out of Taliban hands. We're talking thick pillars of black smoke rising as diplomats threw highly sensitive documents into massive incinerators. They were literally smashing computer hard drives with sledgehammers. Finally, they abandoned the compound, lowered the American flag, and boarded a continuous stream of Chinook helicopters to fly directly into the absolute nightmare waiting for them at the airport.
Section 3. Desperation at the gates.
As the embassy staff touched down, the airport had become the absolute last speck of hope on the entire map of Afghanistan. And the sheer scale of human desperation at the perimeter is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Tens of thousands of civilians surging toward the airport. Families were violently crushed against concrete blast walls and razor wire. People were forced to stand for days in waist-deep open sewage canals just to inch closer to the gates. The terror was so absolute that desperate parents were recorded literally handing their small children over the barbed wire walls to soldiers, just hoping to save them.
Outside the airport, this stark, chilling contrast emerged. Taliban fighters, many who had spent 2 decades hiding in rugged mountains, were suddenly the undisputed leaders of a modern capital of 6 million people. They were casually enjoying the fruits of victory, using abandoned gym equipment, driving bumper cars at a fairground, taking carousel rides. Meanwhile, just beyond the razor wire, civilians were enduring absolute terror, standing in human waste and clinging to the outside of departing airplanes just to escape them.
Section 4. The impossible security task. For the U.S. Marines tasked with guarding the airport, this massive, tightly packed crowd of desperate civilians created a total nightmare security scenario. Intelligence agencies were intercepting alarms that an active bomber was heading for the gates. So I ask you, how do you spot one bomber in a sea of thousands? Snipers were given a description, but as they looked out over crowds of thousands, tightly packed, shoulder to shoulder, chest to chest in those sewage canals, finding one single hidden explosive device in all that chaos was near impossible.
So the crucial point is this led to a terrifying, ironic reality on the ground. You have U.S. Marines essentially trapped on a single runway, totally surrounded by Taliban fighters holding captured American weapons. And because the U.S. was confined to the airport, they had to rely on a terrifying truce. The U.S. military had to rely on their longtime enemy, the Taliban, to provide outer perimeter crowd control to protect them from a mutual enemy, the terrorist organization ISIS-K, who is actively targeting these dense, vulnerable crowds.
Section 5. The Abbey Gate Attack.
Tragically, the exact nightmare scenario that intelligence agencies and the Marines deeply feared became a very dark reality on the evening of August 26th. Despite all the warnings, an ISIS bomber wearing a 25-pound explosive vest, tightly packed with ball bearings, managed to slip through the dense chaos. He made his way right up to Abbey Gate. Now, this gate was the primary security checkpoint, separating the chaotic streets of Kabul from the safety of the runway. This meant thousands of terrified families were packed into a highly confined trench with absolutely nowhere to run when he detonated the device.
The massive explosion ripped through that densely packed canal in a single, devastating instant. Over 170 Afghan civilians, people who were simply standing shoulder to shoulder in raw sewage, desperately seeking freedom for their families, were killed.
In that exact same blast, 13 United States service members also lost their lives, making August 26th one of the absolute deadliest single days for the U.S. military in the entirety of the 20-year war. And it happened just days before the evacuation was scheduled to conclude.
Section 6. The Final Departure. Following the horrific bombing, the reality on the ground shifted immediately. With the threat of even more attacks looming heavily and the August 31st deadline closing in, the rescue mission was effectively forced to a sudden halt. The emotional weight of this next moment is just staggering. The U.S. military permanently welded the airport gates shut. It was a final physical barrier. The civilians who had endured the crushing crowds, the violent Taliban checkpoints, and the deadly sewage canals were suddenly entirely locked out. Thousands of desperate stranded Afghans were left on the outside, forced to turn back to the reality they had just risked everything to escape.
Before we wrap up, we really must acknowledge the sheer logistical scale of what happened behind those gates. Despite the unending chaos, the U.S. pulled off the largest military airlift in history, and it occurred over just 2 weeks. At its absolute peak, a plane was taking off every 45 minutes, with scenes of up to 640 people packed shoulder to shoulder onto the floor of single C-17 cargo flights. Through this massive, frantic effort, an incredible 120,000 people were successfully evacuated. But as midnight approached on August 30th, the mission fell silent. The last C-17 lifted off into the darkness, and that tiny blue dot of the airport on the map finally blinked out. And so, America's longest war officially ended. But it left behind a grim reality. After 2 full decades in the country, after trillions of dollars spent and thousands of lives lost, the conflict ended exactly how it began. The Taliban was back in full, undisputed control of the country, and thousands of desperate Afghan allies were left behind to face a terrifying new reality. Which leaves us with this heavy, final thought for today's explainer. If 20 years of warfare, training, and nation-building ended in a frantic, 72-hour total collapse, What does the future hold for the civilians who are left standing just outside those welded gates? It's a lingering human cost that will be felt for generations. Thank you for joining me to unpack this complex and heartbreaking source material. We'll see you on the next one.